of the reenactment. The first thing you're going to see is Union cavalry moving into action. You will notice and understand the type of unit that they represent by the trim on their uniforms. During the Civil War, infantry would be trimmed in light blue, cavalry in yellow, and artillery in red. The purpose of the cavalry was basically to seek out the enemy. What people don't realize about Vicksburg is while Grant was laying siege to the Confederates inside the city, he had a backside. There's another Confederate army in Jackson, Mississippi gathering to try to relieve Vicksburg. So Grant not only has to watch the Confederates he's surrounded, but he has to watch a Confederate army in his rear. And the Union cavalry played a key role in guarding those approaches and making sure that that Confederate force never was able to threaten General Grant's position. You will notice them getting into formation. They are going to feel each other out on horseback, primarily using saber and pistol, the pistol now being a more common weapon than the saber. And they will skirmish with each other. Basically, again, they're feeling each other out, looking to see how strong they are, what their position is. Commanding one of those Union cavalry units was a man from Pike County. His name was Colonel Mudd. Colonel, I believe his first name is John. John Mudd was an officer in the 2nd Illinois Cavalry, one of those units that was guarding Grant's rear. He will be severely wounded protecting Grant's rear. He will recover from that wound and return to his unit, and he will suffer a terrible fate. In May of 1864, he will board a steamer bound for up the Red River for Alexandria, Louisiana, to help relieve Banks' retreating army, Union Army. They will be ambushed by Confederate cannon and Confederate cavalry. He will lose his life defending the City Belle, the steamer, as well as many of the other Union troops on that vessel. Only a few were able to escape. Most of them were captured. Also killed in that attack was a Union officer by the name of Marcus Spiegel. Does the name Spiegel ring a bell with anyone? Of the Spiegel catalog family. He was a member of that family. Mudd's body would eventually find its way home, and today he rests here in Pittsfield. You will notice they are charging and countercharging each other. Please keep them, the naval, you see, if you look in the distance, look toward the lake. I believe I see a Union naval detachment approaching the battlefield. As well as controlling the land side, a huge Union naval force also assisted General Grant. Under the command of Admiral David Dixon Porter, this naval fleet allowed Grant's army to pass the earthworks on the river at Vicksburg and cross the river south of the city and then swing around and lay siege to the city of Vicksburg. The naval role eventually would play a very key role in the battle, as it would keep Grant's army supplied and provide ammunition and men to keep the siege going. As I said earlier, Grant's total army consisted of about 77,000 men. That's without the naval detachment. So the Confederates are outnumbered about 2-1 in the Battle of Vicksburg. How many of you have been to Vicksburg? You've seen the massive earthworks that still exist. Those are very worn down from what existed in 1863, but you've gotten a good idea of the rough terrain and how powerful those earthworks were to assault. And we're going to be talking about those assaults in just a few moments. On May the 18th, okay, oh, she's coming to look. Wasn't sure what she wanted. On May the 18th, as Grant tightened his siege lines, he ordered his troops to storm the Confederate earthworks. He believed that the Confederates were demoralized, that they were weakened, and that they would be easy to conquer. Well, Grant got a very rude awakening, and his troops were repulsed with heavy losses on the 18th of May, 1863. He decided on a second assault, and it was to take place on the morning of May the 22nd. And that is the assault we're going to be looking at today in some detail. The assault was to be directed along the whole Union line. The piece that we're going to be looking at today in a few moments took place near where the Visitor Center stands today. Just behind it was the 2nd Texas Lunette. Lunette is a term for a fortified earthen fortification, much like the one you see out in front of you. The objective of that part of the line was to capture the 2nd Texas Lunette and the Baldwin Ferry Road, opening the way into the city of Vicksburg. Picked to lead the attack is the 99th Illinois Infantry, 400 men from Pike County. Many of you may have had ancestors that were part of that unit. Their job is to lead forward across that rough terrain and break the Confederate line. And we'll talk more about that when the infantry comes out.
No one dies in this?
In a few moments, the artillery is going to open fire. On the morning of May the 22nd, the infantry assault was to be preceded by an artillery bombardment. The artillery projectiles of that time period were basically 3 different types. You could fire a solid shot, which is basically, some of these guns can fire up to a mile. You basically have a solid shot, which is like throwing a giant bowling ball down a bowling alley. There was exploding shot. If the gunner of the gun crew had good skill, he would time a fuse, which would be inserted into the cannonball, which was hollow and had powder on the inside. And if he timed it correctly, the fuse, when it was overhead of the enemy going downrange, the fuse would be lit by the firing of the cannon.
Where?
As the cannonball was going downrange, if it was timed right, when it reached the enemy and reached that inner charge, it would explode, throwing fragments all over the infantry below. The third type was something called canister, and by far the most deadly. When the infantry assault begins, you're going to see that they are going to be close packed, shoulder to shoulder, row upon row. Canister is basically a giant shotgun shell for a cannon. It's usually 24 ball-bearing sized pieces of metal packed in sawdust and packed in a tin can. When it would fire, the can would disintegrate, the fragments would come apart, and all those pieces of metal would go downrange against the infantry. And when you see the infantry come out, you will understand just how deadly canister can be. You see the Confederate infantry at the far end of the line. They are in field formation. They are shoulder to shoulder, several rows deep, firing at the Union cavalry. The weapons they are using are rifled muskets, most of them, that have an effective killing range of about 300 yards. The rifling tripled the effective strength of a smoothbore weapon, and so at 300 yards you could kill, at 1,000 yards you could injure someone. Basically the point I'm going for is that even though these troops are still using Napoleonic tactics of the late 1700s, early 1800s, weaponry had advanced to a point that it was far more deadly. Now, when the artillery bombardment begins, most of what they would have been throwing at the Confederate earthworks would have been solid shot in order to batter them down. Now, if those earthworks had been built out of brick or out of wood or something that could be shattered, they would do a pretty good job. What do you think happens to solid shot or artillery projectiles if they hit mud? Who wants to venture a guess? Absolutely nothing. And so the Confederate earthworks, which are primarily mud and dirt, hold up very well against the Union bombardment, which will begin here shortly. If you look to the far left, you'll see the Union infantry getting ready for their assault. Now, because of the rugged terrain at Vicksburg, the assault on the 2nd Texas Lynette had to be done very differently. In many cases, you'll read about long lines of men crossing an open field. The ravines at Vicksburg would not allow for that. And so the men of the 99th Illinois are going to do a formation that you don't see very often during the war. They are going to line up 4 across, 400 men. So it'd be 100 rows, 4 across, going down the ravine, charging up toward the 2nd Texas Lynette. And I believe if they stick to the script, the Union infantry is going to start off that way, and then they are going to swing into what's called a line of battle, which is the more typical line of battle of a Civil War engagement. And I'll let you know as they're doing that. Up, the sabers are out. By this point in the Civil War, especially by 1863, the saber was still available to cavalry troops, but they were not the weapon of choice. Almost every cavalryman now relied on the pistol, and multiple pistols. Please keep in mind that all of these reenactors are here at their own expense. We are all volunteers, and their purpose in being here is not in any way to glorify war or violence. Our purpose is to remind everyone of the heroism and the importance of this time period in our history. The American Civil War, and I'll talk more about numbers later, but it is the most critical period in our nation's history. It changed our nation forever, and we'll talk more about that at the conclusion. But please keep in mind that all these individuals that are out here today are here of their own expense. And yes, their uniforms are all wool, they are hot, but that works to their advantage if you get used to it. Everybody know what a radiator in a car is? Well, the nice thing about wool uniforms is underneath they had cotton long johns. And when you begin to sweat in those, the cotton gets soaked and it forms a layer of moisture around your body. Yes, they're still hot, but that layer of moisture in those cotton undergarments and shirt, a linen shirt, act as almost like the radiator in your car, keeping you cool with the wool uniform on the outside. Now, why didn't they just take them off and throw them away? Because you're in the middle of a battle. There was no guarantee it would be where you left it. And I can tell you right now, being out as the weather would get cold, being out there without a wool coat is not a fun experience. You see infantry, if I get out of your way, keep moving around, you'll see Union infantry is moving into position there on the far left. The Union naval force has disembarked, and they are going to form what is called a skirmish line. They are going to spread out from the shoulder-shouldered formation, and their job is to feel out the enemy. Now, skirmishers were not necessarily used in the attack we're talking about today. It was more of a blunt force attack. But I believe what they are going to do is play the role of skirmishers today, leading the attack, feeling for the enemy before the main body of troops come up. Again, you see the Union infantry moving into position. Again, this is the 90. The artillery has opened. The assault is getting ready to take place. Again, the 99th Illinois Infantry will lead the attack. They're all Pike County men. They are part of the brigade of William Benton in the division of Eugene Carr under the command of the 13th Corps of John McClernand, an Illinoisan who rests in the cemetery in Springfield. Confederate artillery has responded. Now keep in mind, as you see the noise and the smoke that is about to develop, what I need you to do in your imaginations is to multiply the noise and the smoke you're going to hear by hundreds, by thousands. Add to it the screaming horses, the wounded men, and you'll get an idea of the confusion of a Civil War battlefield. You see the Navy. The guys are dispersing as skirmishers. Now the infantry is moving forward. Again, because of the ravines, when the 99th made their attack that morning of the May 22nd, 1863, they were four across, coming up a ravine toward the 2nd Texas Lynette. 100 rows of 4 men across. As they approached the Lynette, the Confederates would be waiting for them, having been very little damaged by the artillery bombardment. When they came within range, the Confederates would open fire, not only with their rifled muskets, but with shotguns and anything else they had available. Now, if you think the Confederates were sitting around just waiting, they weren't. Every Confederate soldier had multiple weapons next to him, loaded and ready. Also, they had reserves who were loading the weapons as fast as they would be fired. And so the Confederates were ready and expecting the Union assault. Now, this isn't the only, on the May 22nd, this isn't the only part of the line that's seeing action. Grant had ordered assaults all along the line that morning, and every one of them had completely failed.
Oh, you see the ring?
Again, notice their formation. They are in a battle line, shoulder to shoulder, completely across. This is the more typical battle formation of that time, but not that which was used in this particular assault. But for the sake of our interpretation, they are moving into a battle line. A Civil War regiment on paper would consist of 1,000 men. By the time of 1863, disease, casualties had reduced most regiments to about 400 to 500. They just fired a volley in unison. Again, the idea was to get as much firepower and as many bullets going down range at the same time as possible. Oh, that's a new twist. Spooking the wildlife, guys. There's dinner. Sure. Well, that's a first. Did you see that? Yeah, I wonder where Mom is. Now, what the Confederate infantry is doing at the moment is, again, not something they did during this assault. During this assault, they stayed inside their earthworks. But for the sake of our purposes today, the Confederate infantry is moving out to meet the oncoming Federals. And you see the skirmish line on their left, main body of troops on their right.
I'm hot. get over at 2?
You can see the Confederate infantry is now falling back toward their earthworks. As the 99th came on, in that column of fours, they would be decimated. Over 200 of them would be killed, wounded, or captured. 50% of the men from Pike County who led this assault will be casualties on this day. And we're going to talk about the story of one of those individuals in particular in just a few moments. One member of this unit is going to win the Medal of Honor for his actions on this day, May 22nd, 1863. See the Union infantry now pressing toward the Confederate earthworks. As the attack falters, and the Confederates will continue to pour shotgun, rifle, musket, you throw a few rocks at them. As the attack begins to falter, you will notice at least one individual carrying the national colors will break out from the rest of the unit to try to encourage the men forward to the Confederate earthwork.
Where? The man carrying the national colors is Sergeant Thomas Higgins of Pike County. He will lead the attack carrying the national flag toward the Confederate earthworks. The Confederate soldiers inside the earthworks, dozens of them, would open fire on him. And at a range of 20 to 30 yards, every one of them would miss. To a point that the commanding officer of the 2nd Texas said, "Do not stop shooting. This man deserves to live. Let's take him prisoner." And he was allowed to advance and place the flag of the United States on top of the earthworks, and the Confederates would take him prisoner and take the flag. They are now making their final assault in a line of battle, with Higgins leading the way. You can see he's breaking away as the regiment breaks. This is pretty much exactly what happened. Several dozen Confederates kept pouring shots at him. Every one of them missed, until they were ordered to stop firing. Higgins would reach the works, plant the flag, and he would be taken prisoner. The Union attack is repulsed. And as I said, over 50% of the men from Pike County in the 99th Illinois would lay dead or wounded or captured on the battlefield, including Sergeant Higgins. As a POW, Sergeant Higgins would be taken across the river, the Mississippi, to an exchange camp. An exchange camp was simply a place you were sent as a prisoner and you were traded for a soldier on the other side. Up until 1863, the trading of prisoners of war was common in the Civil War. After 1863, the Union forces under Grant suddenly realized that, hey, the Confederates are going right back into battle. And so the idea of trading soldiers was ended, and then begins the real horror of the POW camps of both the North and the South, of the Andersonvilles, of the Elmiras, of the Camp Douglases. And that is a story that I urge you all to look into, you who have an interest in history. But Grant realized by that point that the only way the Confederacy was ever going to be defeated was to break their will to fight. Higgins would eventually be exchanged. He would go back to his unit. He would survive the war, and he would come back to Pike County. He would eventually settle with his family in Hannibal, Missouri, and he would pass there and rest there today. And after the engagement is done, I will tell you the rest of his story, how he got the Medal of Honor for what you just saw. Some of you may have noticed there are a few ladies out there in uniform. And some of you are probably asking, did women serve as soldiers in the Civil War? The answer to that question is yes. They were few and far between, and they would have had to disguise themselves and live their lives as males. If they were discovered, they were usually, most cases, they were sent home immediately. In some cases, they were such good soldiers, they were not. And afterwards, if you want to hear the story of Sarah Wakeman, who is a Union soldier, a woman, who died under her male alias and rests in the Chalmette National Cemetery, I'll share that story with you afterwards. You see the Union forces trying to make one last push against the Confederate earthworks. After this failed attack, Grant settled down for a siege. He began digging his trenches closer and closer and to starve the Confederates into surrender. They basically would keep shooting at each other, poking at each other, starving each other. And by early July, the handwriting is on the wall. General Pemberton, the Confederate commander, realizes that help is not coming. Grant has him completely cut off. And so on the 4th of July, 1863, General Pemberton will surrender the Gibraltar of the Mississippi, along with 30,000 Confederate prisoners. Casualties in this siege are roughly For the Union forces, they'll lose about 5,000 men, of which about 806 are killed. Confederate casualties are about 32,000, a little over 32,000, 30,000 of which are prisoners, along with wounded, captured, or killed, and one camel. Who knows the story of Douglas the camel? Nobody. Great. Confederates lose one camel in the siege of Vicksburg. Douglas still rests in the cemetery in Vicksburg. Douglas was the descendant of a project of Jefferson Davis. When he was Secretary of War in the Pierce administration, he decided to bring camels to the United States that he thought would work better in the desert Southwest than horses. Well, it didn't work out real well, and to this day, descendants of that cavalry corps, or that camel corps, are still running around out there in West Texas and eastern New Mexico. But Douglas was taken prisoner, basically, by the Mississippi Regiment, became its mascot. Unfortunately, Douglas did not have a good ending. There are two stories about what happened to Douglas. One say a Union sniper got him. Second story is the starving Confederates, by the end of the siege, basically ate him. I happen to think both stories are true. A Union sniper probably did get Douglas, and then the Confederates cooked him and ate him. With the capture of Vicksburg and the capture of Port Hudson on July 7th, 3 days later, the Mississippi River was finally completely in Union hands. The Confederacy had been severed into two, and they would never again have control of the vital riverway. It is really the beginning of the end of the story of the Confederacy. Why is this important? What I want you to remember as you go away from what we commemorate here today is that if all the Americans that were alive in 1861 when this war began, over 700,000 of them would lose their lives in this struggle. There was not a family in this nation that was not affected by this war in some way. 1 out of every 50 Americans that was alive in 1861 was dead by 1865. That is a huge percentage. It is the greatest number of losses in the United States history of all the fatalities we have suffered in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, and up until the 5th year of Vietnam. We just barely equal the number of Americans who perished in our 4-year Civil War. That is why we do what we do, to commemorate the honor and the story of these individuals. The firing is stopped. They're searching for their dead and wounded. And the failed attack is coming to an end. In a few moments, you will see the fighting end. The soldiers will rise, and they will pass in review in front of us. You will also see Sergeant Higgins reappear, probably under a pretty strengthened Confederate guard, and I'll tell you about his Medal of Honor. You see the officers now meeting in the middle to basically formally announce that hostilities have concluded. Okay, we're not sure if Sergeant Higgins and his guard are going to come back this way or not, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you the story, and if he does make it, I'll tell you the story again. His Medal of Honor would not come immediately after the war. It wouldn't be until 1898. And he received that medal for the actions you just saw of reaching the Confederate earthworks and planting the U.S. flag, even though he would be captured in the act. Now, what's interesting about the story is who nominated him for the Medal of Honor. Wasn't anybody in his regiment. Wasn't anybody on the Union side. It was the colonel, an officer in the 2nd Texas. He would write a letter commemorating Sergeant Higgins' bravery and recommending him for the Medal of Honor. And it is through that he would be awarded the medal in 1898. And as I said, I believe he passes in 1917, if my memory corrects me, over in Hannibal. One of the misconceptions that have come down through history that I'll explain to you while we're waiting for the troops to form up. You notice the Confederate flag in front of you. That is the Confederate battle flag. It has been misunderstood that that was ever the national flag of the Confederacy. It was not, never was. It is the battle flag, the square version of which would be flown by the infantry, field units, and an elongated one would be flown by the Navy, the naval ensign. The 3 actual national flags of the Confederacy were first what was called the Stars and Bars. It is a blue field with 11 or 13 stars in it, and a red bar and a white bar. If you look, as you leave, if you look in the Confederate camp on top of the hill, you'll see a Stars and Bars with a cross in the blue field instead of stars. That belongs to the Orphan Brigade. Second national flag of the Confederacy consisted of the battle flag in the field where the stars of the United States flag are, and then the whole rest of the flag where the United States stripes are was white. And what do you think happened to that flag when the wind wasn't blowing on the battlefield? What's it look like? Looks like a surrender flag. So the Confederates decided, we're not going to keep that one. So the third national flag, they would take half of that white field and make it a solid red bar. Those are actually the 3 national flags of the Confederacy. The battle flag, unlike what you hear a lot of today, was never the national flag of the Confederacy. As I said earlier, one of the units that's out there today represents the Orphan Brigade. And this is one of my favorite stories of trying to explain to folks how a divided family everyone was during this conflict. The commander of the Orphan Brigade at the Battle of Chickamauga, who loses his life at the Battle of Chickamauga, is a general by the name of Benjamin Hardin Helm, a personal good friend of Abraham Lincoln. Does anybody know why he was such a good friend to Abraham Lincoln? Well, yeah, you don't count. You better know. You better know. That's going to be one of the things you answer all the time, because you got in trouble for it. Benjamin Hardin Helm is married to Mary Todd Lincoln's half-sister. The Todd family was divided right down the middle during this great struggle between the First Lady of the United States and her brothers who served the Confederacy, and several gave their lives. After Benjamin Hardin Helm lost his life at Chickamauga, his wife was invited by her sister to come to the White House. And boy, did President Lincoln get some grief over that. So eventually she had to be asked to leave and to go back through the lines, back to the Confederacy.
But that is probably the best example I can share with you of how a divided family, all the way up through the presidency of the United States, was affected by this struggle. What they're doing now is clearing their weapons. We want to make sure nobody leaves the battlefield with a loaded weapon.